From here in my office in the University of the Philippines, Diliman, College of Home Economics, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us across the globe. My name is Mary Ann, and I'm the head of the Department of Hotel, Restaurant, and Institution Management. I am joined this morning by our faculty in the department, but just a few reminders before I proceed. Audience will be on mute for the convenience of everyone. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation during the Q&A round. Kindly use the chat function for your comments and the Q&A window for your questions. Under limited time circumstances, we might not be able to accommodate all of them, so feel free to drop us an email and we will forward all your questions to our distinguished speaker. Just so you know, we are also going live on YouTube. And finally, e-certificate is made available upon filling out the feedback survey in which the link is found in the chat box. You may also scan the QR code as you so wish. As it happens, the webinar series organized by the department is built on our tripartite function as a national university, and this is defined by teaching, research, and public service. On July 20, the first webinar series focused on the role of the academe in the new normal, in which we learned from our esteemed guest panelists that academic excellence against the backdrop of the new normal requires different approaches and paradigm shifts. Today, the topic of which is changes in hospitality and research, capitalizing on big data and resilience. It is our objective that after this webinar, we would be able to glean valuable insights on how large volumes of varied data can build resilience and strengthen the service industry, such as hospitality. And equally, to understand how data has changed the traditional theory driven approaches in explaining a phenomena, and even more so in realizing new dimensions in theories. Before I bring our distinguished speaker on, it is my absolute honor and pride to hand you over to Dr. Fidel Nemenzo, Chancellor, University of the Philippines, Diliman. Sir, good morning to you, Chancellor.
Hi, you hear me?
Loud and clear, Chancellor.
Yeah.
Loud and clear.
Good morning to all. Maayong buntag sa tanan. In behalf of UP Diliman, I welcome you to this webinar. Actually, webinar is a new addition to our vocabularies. This webinar is the second in a series, which I understand leads to the 99th birthday celebration of the College of Home Economics. I would like to thank Dr. Mayan Ramos Tumanan and Dean Shirley Guevara for organizing these webinars, which help keep our academic community connected during this time of anxiety and disruption. These discussions are especially important because these discussions are opportunities for us to reflect together on the challenges and changes we face. 2 Sundays ago, on July 26, UP Diliman had its historic and first virtual commencement ceremonies. Some colleges have also had their virtual recognition rights for their graduates, and some have decided to postpone theirs until things normalize. We know, of course, that this will never happen. The world as we knew it, the old normal, is gone. And we might never be able to return to our old comfort zones because the pandemic, COVID-19, has changed the world and the way we do things at a scale that we are now only beginning to understand. We all need to reimagine our lives, our work, in the context of a totally different world. The next world, what it will look like, is yet taking shape. And before we find a vaccine, we need to rebuild supply chains. We need to recreate jobs. We need to rebuild the economy. And among the most badly hit sectors is the tourism and hospitality industry. We say that the pandemic has given our world, our planet Earth, badly needed space to breathe and recuperate. The air is cleaner. Our world is beautiful as ever. The irony is that it might take time before we're able to travel again and see this world with our own eyes. I do hope that when we rebuild our industry, we learn our lessons from the past and from this pandemic, that we work doubly, perhaps triply hard to keep our environment healthy and, yes, beautiful. Let us build back better. In particular, I hope we strengthen domestic tourism so that our people will learn to appreciate the beauty of our country and our cultural heritage. I also hope we promote ecotourism so that we help preserve and regenerate our environment. Well, one thing good about webinars like this is that from our separate homes, we can connect and collectively make sense of and shape the changes that are forthcoming. Our university will surely change. In UP, you and I, as teachers, are busy preparing for the coming semesters, which are marked with uncertainty. We have long known that with new technologies and a new generation of differently wired students, the changing demands of the workplace and the disruptions caused by class suspensions and now pandemics, because of all these, we need to explore non-traditional platforms and more agile and remote modes of learning. What the COVID pandemic has done is to tell us that we cannot postpone this long overdue transformation of the university. And not only of the university, but perhaps all our social institutions, our industries. I'm not a fan of the term, the new normal, but this is really new ground. I am referring not only to the face masked, physically distanced world, but the world as a result of all the profound changes and disruptions in recent decades. And perhaps some of the most dramatic changes we will see are in the tourism and hospitality industry. I hope that for all of you in this webinar, you will find this new world not only challenging, but exciting, because this is an opportunity for reimagination, an opportunity to innovate and test new ideas. This webinar platform is certainly new, and I thank Professor Chris Ryan for being with us virtually to share his insights on tourism and the hospitality management industry, and to share with us his insights and the new ways of seeing and doing that are necessary to rebuild the industry on better ground. Again, maraming salamat sa inyong lahat. Daghang salamat. Thank you for joining this webinar, and I wish all of you a good morning.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Nemen. So we value your voice of wisdom, and we in the department are genuinely grateful for making time to be with us this morning despite your extremely uh, hectic schedule. Maraming salamat, Chancellor. Maraming pong salamat. Now allow me to introduce our distinguished guest speaker. He is the Foundation Professor of Tourism at the University of Waikato Management School in New Zealand. As a researcher, he has over 220 refereed journal publications and has won various awards for his research. He has, according to Google Scholar, an H index of 73 and approximately 23,000 citations. Wow, can you beat that? That's just a lot. He was the editor-in-chief of Tourism Management for 25 years, is now its Emeritus Editor. He founded the journal Tourism Management Perspectives in 2012 and currently the editor of Tourism Critics, Practice and Theory. He has authored or co-authored 14 books, including 2 on tourism in China, and this year, his Advanced Tourist Destination Management is published by Edward Elgar Publishing. His research interest includes tourist motivation and behavior and the consequences of that behavior. He has acted in various advisory positions, including for the APEC Tourism Ministers meeting, various ministries in New Zealand, and has been a member of the Waikato Tourism Advisory Board since 1999. He is our international advisor for our ongoing longitudinal research on the Batanes Archipelago Islands, within which we try to examine the impacts of hospitality and tourism on the Ivatans. And this we envisage to be under the auspices of the United Nations World Tourism Organization, International Network of Sustainable Tourism Observatories, or the UNWTO INSTO in the long run. Furthermore, and most tellingly, he has been noted as being in the top 1% of global researchers, according to a report published in Plos One. On a personal note, I consider him as a mathematical sociologist through which his insights in the interest of knowledge growth is shaped by paradox and juxtaposition, and complementing it with empirical accounts through which the complementarity between these two domains affords new musings and stimulates critical reflection. I'm sure that his formal doctoral students will also agree with me. To that point, I request all of you to look at your meeting controls and then check the reactions button and click either clapping hands or thumbs up as you join me in welcoming Professor Chris Ryan. Chris, kia ora.
Kia ora, can you hear me now?
Yes, very clear, Chris.
Right, okay, let me just get my, there we go, right. Well, thank you for such an introduction, Marianne. I feel you're setting me up to fail after such such an opening. Whether I can live up to that opening is really for others to decide, but you made me distinctly nervous.
No, yeah.
Anyway, welcome to you all, or as we would say in New Zealand, kia ora, tēnā katoa, tēnā katoa, tēnā katoa, which is a Māori, and you'll notice that I welcome you thrice, and I welcome you individually, I welcome you as a group, and I also welcome you as representatives of your wider world outside of this virtual reality of a webinar. Now, I have to start my stopwatch because we did have a run through and it took me at least 35 minutes, and Marianne told me that was far too long. And she has insisted that I should finish in approximately 15 to 20 minutes, because the main purpose is not that you should listen to me as such, but we should have a conversation and exchange ideas. So hold on, there we go. So what am I going to cover? Well, first of all, as your Chancellor has said, I'm going to state the obvious. We live in a very uncertain period. But I would say that we're not helpless in this period, because we do have lots of data, or data, depending on how you pronounce it. And thirdly, we do have lots of good people. And fourthly, we are a resilient group of people. And I think the hospitality and tourism industry has shown this in the front of other crises in the past. And we're aided by the fact that I think it's intrinsic to human beings that we do love to travel. We do like to see the world. And in seeing the world, perhaps we begin to better understand ourselves. But it's not going to be entirely easy. You notice that the subtitle of the talk was the Janus effect. We're looking backwards and we're looking forwards. We're looking towards the light and we're looking towards the dark. But my main theme is really data, because it seems to me that with advances in artificial intelligence and with the data sets that are increasingly becoming available to us, both as managers who have to make decisions and as researchers, we are indeed beginning to move into a totally different world. Historically, of course, data has always been in part about forecasting. And I'm sure you have seen the forecasts that have been published by Parter based on the work that's done by our good friends at Hong Kong, Polly Yu and Haiyan Song. I'm not going to spend a lot of time over these. You've seen them. And basically, they're indicating that for the Asia Pacific area, we should be in a process of recovery by 2021 and moving back, they think, onto our original forecast growth rate by 2022. They break it down into lots of other subsections, etc. You can examine them as easily as I. But one of the problems about those sorts of forecasts is that they're based on time series. And in the current pattern, time series are not necessarily a good guide. They basically work on extrapolating the past into the future. This is a piece of work that I did recently for one of our projects. And you can see that the last part of the diagram is
Chris, I'm sorry about that.
Over the place. Yes,
sorry,
Marianne?
Chris. I have you screen shared. I have you screen shared.
Oh, you can't see it all. Okay.
Yep.
I'm sorry about that. One moment.
It's all right.
Okay. I seem to have now lost contact.
It's all right.
No, these things are sent to try us. I know that only too well. Right. There we go. Right, you see that now?
All good, all good. Thank you, Chris.
Right, thank you. There we are. See, I told you I wouldn't live up to Marianne's introduction. Anyway, the problem, if we just go back very, very quickly and not to waste any time, what we see is that part of made the forecast. Basically, as I said, we should be returning to the original forecast pattern by 2022. And one of the problems about this is we're extrapolating past trends. And when we do that, it's not really particularly useful at the current moment, because as the Chancellor indicated, we're living very much in a very different world. We're definitely living in a world of big data or data. And if, for example, if we went on to Google Trends and we searched for the word COVID, the word COVID hardly entered into our awareness until literally the beginning of this year. And you can see February 23rd is when it begins to increase. And Google Trends is indicative of the type of information sources that are open to us. And we can make comparisons between different types of searches. We now have plenty of research which actually shows if you want to know, or at least pre-COVID-19, one of the best ways of knowing how much demand might exist for a particular destination in the next 3 months, you went on to Google Analytics or Baidu Analytics, depending on where you're on the world, and you basically looked at the pattern of searches. And what we had found was that there were close correlations between actual visitor numbers for a destination, and indeed, in some cases, even for particular iconic hotels, that we would then find there was a correlation between those patterns of searches and the subsequent arrivals in the next couple of months. So we're moving very much where data is no longer just a historical record, but it's something that is actually dynamic. What I want to talk about in my examples is I'm just drawing upon some of my recent research and just indicating to you the sorts of things that can be of use to you, either as a manager of a hotel or as a restaurant or as a researcher. And a lot of these things are not necessarily overly expensive. So, for example, we all know that if you've got a restaurant or a hotel, you can look up TripAdvisor, Google reviews, and you find people are writing and giving free almost of their services and information and their opinions of what you can do. So we look up TripAdvisor And we can then begin to start to use web scraping software. So this I did basically as a give you a local Filipino example, except I then found there were not many comments about this particular restaurant. But you can see I went into a piece of web scraping software. It's called Web Harvey. It happens to be one of the cheaper forms of software that are around. You can capture all of the text that the people have actually written, and then you can put that all onto an Excel spreadsheet. You can back it up with all sorts of other information, such as perhaps the gender of the person who's made the review. And you can then proceed and start to analyze all of the sorts of text that are actually present. So we can then create word clouds, and the word clouds, this is a very simple example. There can be a lot more complex things, but they tell us about what people are saying about, in this case, this particular restaurant. The food is great, it's a great restaurant, it's awesome. In this case, because the number of respondents are so few, it's not particularly useful, except that if I were the restaurant owner, I'd be very pleased to look at the sentiment analysis, which is actually telling us there are far more positive things being said about this restaurant than negative things. If in fact we have much larger sets of data, we can begin to do a lot more interesting things. This comes from a piece of research that actually does come out of our UNWTO research unit, which is based on a seaside resort town in New Zealand called Raglan. And we web scraped, and we've got literally thousands of reviews and comments. And what we can then do is identify quite clearly the main themes that exist within that sort of patterns of information. And we can go even further to then have a look at the strength between the different themes. In other words, with the data sets that are available to us and what we can do today, what used to be very much an intuitive process of looking at what people were saying is beginning to cross very much in that mixed methods paradigm to the quantification of verbal statements that we now have. And I know there are issues with this, but you can look at the work that's been done by people like Rob Law, for example, where in fact the artificial intelligence can even then begin to identify what are false or odd sentiments that are being expressed by people and try to hone in on the reliability of this form of analysis. One of the other things we're doing at the moment is with reference to one of the Maori-based products in Rotorua. Rotorua is, if you like, the golden part of Maori tourism in New Zealand. And we have there 4 places that are very, very similar. If you ask the suppliers of or the management of each of the 4 locations, they'd be able to tell you quite clearly what are the unique points about their particular location as against the other 3. But when we have a look at what people are saying on TripAdvisor and Google reviews, they are all very much saying the same thing. It's all about Maori culture, it's about Maori food, it's about Maori entertainment. And therefore, why should they choose one of these places as against another of the places? And that's in effect what we're researching. We're helping one of these locations to try to identify what is specific to them that others cannot do. And sometimes, therefore, very simple things begin to emerge as points of difference. This is an analysis that we did. This one relates to the Tamaki Maori village. Great experience, food was good, hangi dinner, great night, educational fun, Maori culture. That's common to all 4 competing locations. This one has something different that the others don't, namely the stories that are told by their bus drivers. What we can then begin to do is to begin to shape people's expectation and try and emphasize what may be to them a subsidiary part of the whole experience. We then begin to create and make important for them. And that then begins to enable differences to occur. The world is full of data today. Can we use that data? Well, this is where we come to the resilience of our organizations. It depends on the quality of the people who work for us. It depends upon the culture that we generate, our way in which managers actually are prepared to listen, if you like, to some of the specialists, but are the specialists who are doing all of these forms of analysis actually aware of the nature of the business? So it depends upon a culture of a community or the culture of a hotel. It depends on whether that culture can build up a resilience and an ability to adapt quickly based on informed decision making by using the data. And one of the terms that's now entering our literature is the ambidextrous knowledge management system. A rather complicated word perhaps, but really quite simple. What do we mean by the ambidextrous and what do we mean by organizational culture? What we're talking about in effect are systems of people, their training, their skills, the culture that we have, the material and financial and social capital that we have are all helping to generate knowledge systems which are informing all of these three things. We're not looking at individual items anymore. In a lot of our research, we're looking at complex systems. And of course, all of these are related to each other. So what's the ambidextrous knowledge system? We're back to Janus. We look outward, we look inward. We're looking at data that we get from our internal audits, from our levels of investment. The hotel industry is continually making decisions. It's decisions about where to locate the hotels. What brand of hotel are we actually going to be using? What's the size of the hotel? What's the number of rooms of the hotel? We are looking for large sets of data. And if you ask me what large data means, it means effectively moving towards populations. And we look outward, we look towards the market, the levels of competition, all of those sorts of things. And if we want to be innovative and resilient, then we're having to ask ourselves subsections or sub-questions like how do we price our service? And again, we look at the data sets that increasingly our own organizations are creating. You have loyalty schemes, and therefore we want to know about who are our repeat guests, what's their level of expenditure. And of course, for the major chains of hotels, they are increasingly establishing very large amounts of data. We also have, of course, lots of public structure of data. In New Zealand, for example, we have what's called the data infrastructure system. And we can examine this, and that system is subject to a lot of legislative framework relating to privacy. But we can ask questions of our data, such as, in this case, how many people are looking for a luxury lodge at a cost of over certainly $250 per night for a stay of less than 3 nights, who don't have children, and for whom the Waikato is a secondary destination? These are very, very precise types of questions. But we have the data sets which can give us, in fact, precise information. What our data set, when we examine it, tells us is that there are 52,000 potential trips who fit this definition of not having children, interested in luxury lodges. And we have also all sets of other information about what, for example, they are wanting to do, what other alternative types of accommodation they might be interested in. We also find out how many of them are using Facebook, how many are using Google, because we live in a world of such interconnectedness. As you know, every time you move, your cell phone is giving a GPS location. So it raises a whole set of questions as to the type of management and how we can actually organize and utilize the information that we actually have. And this also is for us as researchers. What is it that we are wanting to do? I sometimes say, and I said recently to one of my doctoral students, you better get the article published fairly quickly, because in 10 years' time, artificial intelligence may well be writing the article. Already we see standardized phrases being used, and we need people who are innovative and resilient who can come up with the innovative question. We need the strategic thinkers, but by the same token, we then need people who can implement the strategies and who can implement the tactics. But they too need to understand data. They need to understand the basis of the advice that they are being given. So we need perhaps to supplement the human, and we're already doing this in so many different ways. If, for example, you wanted to come to Hamilton, come to New Zealand, this is one of our major hotels. They don't pay me to say this. But if they're a member of the Accor group, as you can see, it's a Novotel branded hotel. And what then you can, if you log on, you get responses, and the responses are not coming from a human being. Major hotel chains, major airlines, they're all increasingly using talk bots. And the Turing test, whether you can judge whether you're being responded to by a human being or whether you're being responded to by, in this case, a robotic type of voice or an artificial intelligence, is getting tougher and tougher to say. In the restaurants, we're beginning to see the advent of robotics coming in. Many dishes are actually fairly standardized. The pizza is a typical example. And robotics can now, there's an American chain which is using robots to actually prepare your pizza. So we're moving into a world where we have systems of social capital, organization, resilience, ambidextrous knowledge, etc. And the thing that feeds all of this is, in fact, data. And we have so many tools. Many of you will recognize this. This comes from Smart PLS. It's one of those pieces of software that has become extremely popular in recent years. Why? Because it takes us a step beyond the normal regression analysis. Regression analysis might tell you what is the relationship between determining variables and a determined variable, and it will tell you how a determined variable will respond to changes in the determining variable. Confirmatory factor analysis and structural equation model now begins to give us more precisely the relationships between the individual determined variables. Again, all of these approaches that I've said don't actually assume incredible amounts of knowledge on the part of the researcher or indeed of the manager. They're not necessarily overly expensive, but these are the sorts of things that you need to be doing as researchers, as people who have students. We've got to be preparing our students for the new world. Data is a key fact. I've managed to do all of this within 20 minutes. So thank you very much for listening.
All right. Chris, could you please stop screen sharing? Right. Okay. Thanks very much for that, Chris. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the kind of topic within which Chris could talk about for more than 1 hour, for 2 or 3 hours. But, time is not on our side. So I'm sorry about that, Chris, that you will have to really cut it short. But that's very interesting and insightful. And we have had a very, a few questions. So I have a few, like a couple, and these are drawn from the registrants as we review their questions. So this one, okay, my first question for you, Chris, is this. How do you see the industry as an agent of resilience, which can build and strengthen its ability to survive the negative impacts of COVID-19?
Well, first of all, I found it very interesting, the Chancellor's opening comments, because here in New Zealand, we're actually operating in a somewhat possibly unique environment, because we're almost living a normal life at the moment, because we don't have COVID-19. But we do have enormous discussions, and the discussions related to this are about contact tracing and things of that nature. And if you want to be resilient in the current environment, I think you probably will need very good contact tracing systems. But that perhaps is not what you had to, or what the person asking the question had in mind. How do we develop resilience? Well, we're educators, and as educators, we're trying to train people. And we do know that the world in which our 20-year-olds are going to be living in another 20 to 30 years could well be a very different world to what we have today. Mm-hmm. And it will be a world with much greater artificial intelligence, much greater forms of robotics. And there's been a number of pieces of work that have been forecasting the level of jobs that will be lost. And I think those sorts of forecasts have been driven away from our minds because of the current environment. We're very much dealing with a current crisis, but there are longer term crises. And there are at least two that we can identify fairly easily. One is the advances in AI and robotics, and the other, of course, is climate change. Resilience depends on an ability to be able to interpret data. And that means, how are we training our students? How are we training our students to not just use data, but also examine the nature and the basis of that data? This morning, I was asked to review an article, and I just found it to be basically number crunching and showing a remarkable lack of knowledge about the data sets that were being used. I think questions are easy to ask, answers are much more difficult. But what is important is that we make people aware of the information that they can use and how they can interpret that information and apply that information in order to come up with coping strategies.
Mm-hmm. Well, picking up from what you said, information is very important. But then a follow-through question would be, can big data really predict future results when actually current condition is volatile and dynamic? You know, especially when we just follow or adhere to the government's policies, which really change quickly. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think increasingly our data, big data, is dynamic data. And when you consider how, in fact, increasingly we are providing data, for example, for our movements through the GPS systems, every time we log on to the internet, we're leaving traces of data. It becomes very, very dynamic. And that data increasingly will be faster arriving at us. Here in New Zealand, 5G is coming in at the end of this year. Already we have work in 5G in Auckland. One of my research sites in China, in the museum sector, 5G is coming in. We have already the world's first 5G museum. And once we talk about a world of 5G, we're talking about extremely fast transfers of data. It affects the way in which we'll be using cars. Tesla's dream, you know, Elon Musk's dream, is that the cars are talking to each other. And if the cars are talking to each other, we're moving into a very different type of world to the world which we currently occupy. And I know this sounds like science fiction, but I think we've already seen, we're so used to our cell phones, and we've talked to people and we see their images. We're talking here on a global internet of satellites flying around in the sky. Science fiction is becoming our new reality. And you've only got to listen to these thinkers and look at the work which have been written by the commentators on AI. And I truly believe that our information and flows of data are going to become dynamic flows and not just historic flows. And under those circumstances, yeah, the sorts of things that I said in the talk at the beginning, where we extrapolate past trends, which is a pretty useless process when the trend is that of a crisis, and it is totally disruptive, and where our domestic tourism in New Zealand is doing very well, but our international tourism is practically zero. what's the point of extrapolating a past trend? But when you have complete fast flows of information that's being generated, even as we move and turn on our internet and our computers, it is a very different world.
Mhm. Very well said, Chris. So, which leads me to my next, which is relatively related question and timely and relevant. And now I'd like to dwell on before I move to the Q&A window about integrity and the data reliability. So the question is, how do we ensure reliability of data amidst the threats of troll accounts and biased evaluations?
Well, I think at the moment, well, first of all, if it's statistical data from the past, we know that there are well-proven statistical tests which judge the reliability of data. And of course, there are various tests that can be undertaken to test validity in a more limited way. In terms of trolling, etc., I think what we're beginning to see is that the piggybacking process is speeding up. 4 years ago, when during the American elections, there's strong rumors, of course, that there was interference with trolling that related in some of the tweets and other aspects of social media. What we're beginning to see is that the analytical software, the fact checkers are catching up. It's back to what I said before. What we're beginning to see are significant increases in the speed and checking and in the algorithms. And when we get to the point where artificial intelligence is beginning to write the algorithms, that I don't see in the immediate future, but it will come. And I think basically we know, if you talk to the hackers and the people who are responsible in the hacking processes, the period between trolling taking place and being able to identify where those adverse and negative comments are coming from is getting shorter and shorter. The speed of communication is speeding up enormously. And therefore, I think what we will eventually get, and even Facebook is now beginning to realize it has to do something that is tighter. But I think basically the process is one where we catch up much more quickly. That won't stop trolling, and of course there are, what happens when the AI itself starts trolling.
Right.
You begin to move into very fluid worlds.
Okay,
That's
thanks.
a bit of a very loose answer, I know, but anyway, let's move on.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. Now I will turn you over to Raymond, who will facilitate our live Q&A session. Raymond.
Thank you, Marianne. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Raymond.
Some questions from the Q&A box.
Yeah.
What is your take on data privacy issues?
My take, right. Well, I gave you some examples just now from our New Zealand data infrastructure system and the system that we set up for being able to analyze markets for particular types of activities or demands for particular hotels, etc. That's data infrastructure network can only be accessed by, I think it's now 7 computers, which are basically in the universities. And they're hedged around with so much protection to protect privacy. The people who are supplying it, and that information contains credit card information, passport information, the type of house in which people are living, their income, tax data, all of those sorts of things. This is what gives, if you like, that data such a powerful veracity, but individuals are not named. And in order to access this data, you yourself have to go through a process. And as a colleague said to me, it's worse than signing the Official Secrets Act. No way can, in fact, people be identified from the aggregation of data. And of course, in terms of either for a lot of the research that we do, and particularly from the viewpoints of management and potential patterns of demand for hospitality services, we're primarily interested in aggregated data that is large enough, which allows the sub-aggregate level to be valid. But that doesn't take us, that doesn't mean to say that we're interested in necessarily individuals as such. What we're interested in are the types of people. So what we have developed in our infrastructure system is a very tight protection of privacy. Interestingly enough, in New Zealand, when we have had issues of privacy, it's partly been because the sources have come from outside of the infrastructure network, and somebody's made a mistake when they've been sending an email. I think that type of mistake is increasingly going to be less plausible in the future. In effect, privacy is extremely important, but I think another factor is I believe that our perception of the concept of privacy will change. If we live in a totally transparent world, perhaps the moral judgments that people might be making also become less black and white. If everybody's foibles are there to be found, then we become tolerant of those foibles, I suspect.
Okay, thank you, Chris. One more question. What are the innovations that the hotel industry are going to have in order to cope with the current situation? How can they engage more guests to stay at a hotel?
Well, the immediate reaction around the world at the moment, I think, is we all have to depend upon our domestic tourism. So let's divide the question into sort of short and medium and long term. In the short term, here in New Zealand, we're like a lot of other people, we're dependent, as I said earlier, purely on domestic tourism. That sounds as if we're, prior to COVID-19, domestic tourism was only accounting for about 55% of total tourist expenditure. But on the recent school holidays, if you ask the hotels what their occupancy rates, I can tell the occupancy rates of a major hotel in Hamilton, where I'm living, is 85%. In the recent holiday period, we were 19% up on what we were last year. Now you ask, well, how is it that something that was providing only 55% of total expenditure is now basically achieving 85% of the total demand? Well, the answer in part is the 1.4 million New Zealanders who used to travel overseas can't travel overseas. So they're now switching into part of the domestic market. So given that every country is both a tourist receiving and a tourist generating location, those tourists that it generated who were went offshore will now have to holiday within the country. So they're adding to the domestic demand. So what, of course, Tourism New Zealand has been doing is pumping out adverts aimed at the domestic market. I rather suspect that every national tourism organisation and every regional tourism organisation is now marketing as best that it can towards the domestic market. Now, in the longer term, what will be happening is that, of course, hotels are increasingly going to be acquiring more information about their marketplaces. And I think we're probably going to move into much more individualised marketing, in the sense that we will begin to have information on our past clientele. And this is something anyway that marketing people were talking about prior to COVID-19. We've talked about the fact that people are wanting experiences and we individualize things much more. And I think the resilience comes in being able to identify and give the more personalized, individualized service and a movement away from the mass market. And again, that is aided by advantages in data sets and in electronics. I have a colleague who came back from Amsterdam a few years ago, and she was saying about how she liked playing around with all the lighting levels in her room, to which my response is, you've left behind now a personal record. Should you ever go back to that hotel in the future, you'll walk into the room and there will be your favorite lighting arrangement. because you've left a record. And I think that's what will happen as we travel. We leave records, we have our preferences, and when we book into the same hotel, we will find that our most preferred option is the one which we're now being offered. Comes
Thank you,
back
Chris.
to the use of, comes
Yes.
back again to the use of information.
So one more question, because we have students on board. What is a good alternative for tourism students in the future if this pandemic lasts more than a year?
Well, the interesting question is, what is our economy, what any country's economy is going to look like if in fact COVID-19 mutates and we're not able to get rid of it by the use of vaccines. Domestic tourism will generate a number of jobs. We're seeing that at the moment. We know that our export industries, and this again will be true of every country, export industry will be important. I think hospitality students do have certain advantages. One of the key things about hospitality is it is a people-orientated industry. And those social skills that one acquires is going to be quite important in many forms of business. I think the process of making our products more individualized for the customer is not unique to hospitality. The same thing seems to be occurring across a whole range of service industries. And I think if I was a young student at the moment starting a course at a university, I'd be really quite pleased, and I'm not graduating until about 3 or 4 years hence. And you hope that in 3 or 4 years hence, Parter is right, and we're back on that growth rate, which was being identified before. If I'm graduating this year, I'm going to be really quite worried, and I'll probably be starting to think, well, perhaps I've got some great ideas. I'll be going into business for myself, or I'll be studying a postgraduate course, to be honest. Again, I think it's one of those questions which are easy to ask, but the answer lies in the heavy contextualized position of the individual and what opportunities and resources are open to them.
I think we could still accommodate one more question. What is your take about virtual tourism? How would this affect the economy or the hospitality and tourism industry?
Well, it will mean that the person who is taking the virtual trip now has more money to spend at home. And you probably hope that they will spend it at home and they will spend part of it on traveling. Because whilst I know the CEO of Parter is very keen on virtual realities, on holographic representations, but I think intrinsically humans will always know, at the moment anyway, when they are sitting in a simulation of reality and reality itself. And most of us prefer reality. So I think virtual reality in the interim period of time will be used as a stimulate for travel, but we would still want the real thing. It might be a way of seeing things that we would not normally be able to see, but it becomes an extension of our social media. And I know Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message, and there's a lot of implications of that. But as I said, come back to what I said originally. If I'm using virtual reality to travel, that means I'm saving money where I can now spend on travel in my home environment.
Thank you, Chris. I turn over the floor to Marianne. Marianne?
Thanks, Raymond. I just realized since most of us who are in this webinar are members of the academy, a very quick answer from you, Chris, about what do you see interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research, or in what way do you see multidisciplinary research play out on big data and resilience, and what would be some common framings?
Well, of course, tourism is multidisciplinary. Indeed, management is multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, if we wish to use those terms, because they're all based on a combination of the classic social sciences and disciplines, and to some extent also the scientific disciplines, because we're using sociological and psychological theories. We're applying them within marketing environments. We're talking about management, but we don't just manage organizations, we also manage experiences. We are also managing people to deliver those services. So in terms of, if you like, the core disciplines, we are integrating and creating fusions of those disciplines as they apply to our context of hospitality and or tourism. But we're also bringing in other sorts of disciplines increasingly. From the geography perspective, we're looking at geographical patterns, both on a macro scale and even on the micro scale, where as we design a hotel, for example, you're engaged in landscaping, you're engaged in sight lines, you're engaged in consideration of the fabrics. You might also be concerned with environmental sciences as to the load factoring, the soil bearing factors for the types of accommodation that you wish to build. Is it a high-rise hotel or is it a low-level hotel? Very, I begin increasingly to see knowledge as complex systems rather than as individual items. And I think increasingly that's how we move. If you consider what we teach at an undergraduate level, much of what we are teaching at the undergraduate level has been known for a number of years, if not decades. What we're looking at is taking that knowledge and applying it into totally different shifting environments. And that then takes us back to using these techniques to encourage people to think and to think constructively and in an innovative way.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, I was just prompted to wrap it up and all because of time constraints. So as we wrap, I thought that I will pull this together by asking you a quick and a closing question, Chris, if you don't mind. So a quick question would be, if you have a magic wand, what would you do to change or mitigate the magnitude of impacts that the industry, hotel and tourism at large, is actually experiencing?
Magic wand. If I had the
Yep.
magic wand, my name be Harry Potter.
Yes. The
Not
Wizard of
Chris Ryan.
Oz. Yes.
I think it really does come down to what's been a theme, I think, throughout most of this presentation. And as I've been talking, I've been thinking a lot of it seems at a rather generic level. But it is about being able to take information and manipulate, use, and apply to specific sets of circumstances. And whilst you might say we're in the specific sets of circumstances that we're in at the moment is where we see a decline of demand. But what we should be really talking about is not necessarily a generic decline in demand. We're talking about the decline in demand for a particular hotel, for a particular restaurant, which is serving a particular location. And if you know the details of that location, you're probably able to come up with something that will appeal for the individuals within that location. Or if you're talking about tourism, and we're talking about a world of domestic tourism, then you're talking about travel time and the specifics of travel time for your potential market. How are you going to appeal to people who are 2 hours drive time away? Are they likely to return and make a 4-hour journey, or are they going to require overnight accommodation? So I think there are lots of, you have to be able to integrate, if you like, the strategic with the specific. And that perhaps is one definition of resilience.
All right.
Can't do that.
Plus probably a vaccine to finally be, in sight. So we will all go back to our better normal life. All right. Last question, Chris, and this is could be a key takeaway for us here in the webinar. We know that we would never see the world again like we did before. And in your presentation, you said that it will take until probably year 2023 um, So the question is, how do you see the impact of COVID-19 affecting the landscape of research in hospitality and tourism at large? It's probably as a key takeaway, Chris.
Well, I could be very cynical. I mean, the first thing that COVID-19 led to was a lot of editors sending out requests for papers at a stage where I think it's far too soon to actually assess the potential outcome of COVID-19. And therefore, one thing is we shouldn't just jump on every passing wagon because it's fashionable and it's a fad. So that's one thing. Don't rush to write your articles on COVID. Rather think about the longer term trends. And the longer term trends we're facing as a world a significant amount of trends. I've referred to the fact that what's going to be the pattern of employment in the next 20 years? What's going to be the nature of the world's climate in 20 years' time? What's going to be the nature, arguably, of the impact of an aging population in 20 years' time? What's going to be the global political framework that emerges from that? We could say at the moment, you look at a society like China, China's facing enormous problems. Its rate of growth is slowing down. Its population is aging. The number of workers that are the number of people of working age as a proportion of the population in China is falling. Productivity is falling. So what the hell is it going to look like in another 20 years? And the people that we are teaching in most part in their early 20s, this is the stage in 20 years' time when they'll be worrying about their 5-year-old children.
I agree. So thank you very much, Chris. Everything you said has stirred our and stimulated our interest, our critical thinking skills. Thank you very much indeed. And ladies and gentlemen, can we give Chris another round of applause or thumbs up, please? All right. So at this point, I wish to call on the dean, the college dean, Dr. Shirley Guevara, who is actually one of our faculty in the department, for her closing remarks. Dean.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Tumanan. I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you are at the moment. But please allow me to thank our esteemed panelist, Professor Chris Ryan, for the gift of time and expertise. Chris is a very busy man given his stature as the world-renowned academic and leading researcher in tourism and hospitality. So we are deeply honored for his presence in this webinar as articulated by our Chancellor. We are about to celebrate our 100 years as a discipline. That means a discipline as a whole economics, faculty members, and academics. That will be next year. And so these webinars are actually prelude to our celebration. And so thank you very much, Chris, for this honor, for making this webinar very special for us. I would also like to thank Dr. Mary Antumanan for making this possible. And I would like to congratulate her and my colleagues in the Department of Hotel, Restaurant, Institution Management, and our partner, the UP Computer Center, for another successful webinar. Lastly, we would like to thank you, dear participants, for spending once again your time with us this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean Guevara. And at this point, a big shout out to the Department of Hotel, Restaurant, and Institution Management, to the faculty, just like what the Dean said, for making this possible. Can you please switch on your video to be recognized, please? And then so with the Chancellor, we would like to see you as well. So again, thank you very much, in particular to Lar Maranan as the program director for the past two webinars, to Raymond to facilitate the Q&A window today, and Princess and Beth for taking care of our chat box and YouTube channel. I also would like to thank AVP Delia Tomacruz for being the moderator for the first webinar, for Danielle to facilitating the Q&A last time, and of course to Teen, our reliable staff in the department, and our partner, the UP Computer Center, Will Malikanta and Army. Of course, to our good Chancellor who stayed up until this time despite his busy schedule. Maraming salamat, Chancellor. And of course, to all of you, our audience, our sincerest thank you for being with us today. And to Chris, oh, do I see my faculty members now? Perhaps we could start waving. All right. And to Chris, thank you very much indeed. Until we meet again, we will meet again, and take care of yourself. So on my end, I will have to say goodbye for now and stay safe, everyone. Bye. Can we all wave?
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Salamat.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Chancellor.
Chancellor. Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Chris.
Chris.
Thank you,
Thank
Chris.
you, everyone.
Thank you, Dean.
Okay. All right.